Alright, so after another break, we're finally getting back to Teen Titans reviews, and we're starting off with an interesting, I'm going to say filler episode, even though it does leave a lasting impact on Cyborg as a character. But you'll get an impression of what I mean as the review goes on. The episode opens on Cyborg having used up all of the money that they don't earn vigilanteing, buying a bunch of cool shit for the tower. Apparently having justified these purchases to Robin by claiming that his upgrades would help them fight crime better.
Evil beware. We have waffles.
I mean, those waffles aren't going to do much to help, sure, but I bet if you guys played the Waffles, Waffles, Waffles song loud enough on loop during battle, your enemies would turn themselves in to stop the pain. It comes down to Cyborg trying to justify the purchases, though, trying to defend the various tech items that he acquired. But as he does so, he accidentally vaporizes himself. Oh, no, wait, he just sends himself 5,000 years back in time via a speaker system, as you do, ending up in, as I said, 5,000 years ago time, which is of course the time period in which he can't repair his tech or recharge himself. So he needs to get out of there really frickin' fast, which is of course easier said than done because he shows up right in the middle of a battle between a bunch of warrior villagers and a bunch of radioactive green slime bug things. And at first he doesn't want to get involved in the fight because he doesn't want to risk changing history. But then when he sees a warrior in full armor about to be overwhelmed by these creatures, he can't help himself. He uses his weapons to defeat them, draining himself considerably in the process. But he does save that warrior and the rest of the villagers by destroying all of the attackers at once. This, however, causes him to show up the village champion, Crawl. And it turns out, on top of that, the guy he saved isn't actually a guy at all. She's this hot chick named Sarasim, who's like the leader of the village, I guess. And so she takes Crawl's sword and gives it to Cyborg, making him their village champion instead. Which is particularly problematic when it turns out that Crawl's the one that brought the creatures there in the first place. He heads off to a cave to talk to a witch. He has apparently released her, and now she is bound to grant his wishes. And he wished for the village to be attacked by a threat that he could defeat and become a legend. And then when it turned out that he couldn't beat all the bug creatures, he wished for the power to stop them, and that's why Cyborg actually showed up there. The witch is the one who brought him there. And it's super clear to everyone except for Crawl that this witch has some sort of sinister ulterior motive. She's trying to screw Crawl over one way or another. At the very best, she's kind of monkey's paw-esque in that all of the wishes that she grants in some way turn sour. For example, obviously Crawl wants to get rid of Cyborg, and sending Cyborg home isn't his first thought. He wants Cyborg dead so that he can be the hero and reclaim his role of village champion. But rather than just zap Cyborg to death or something, the witch sends another attack against the village. Another attack that Crawl can't handle himself, and Cyborg at this point, though he's been trying to build a generator to restore his power, hasn't been able to restore his power. His batteries are low, he can't rely on his weapons anymore. But weapons or not, he's still a really smart guy, so he punches through a dam wall, not like a damn wall, but like the wall of a dam, and floods the battlefield, drowning all of the creatures but none of the villagers, thankfully. And even though he damages his hand in the process, which is something that he can't undo in this environment, he's still managed to save everyone himself. This leads to Crawl going to the witch and finally asking her to just send Cyborg home, which in turn leads to Crawl coming to Cyborg to lead him back to the witch so that she can send him home through a portal. Because I guess you can zap somebody from the future to the past, but you can only send them back from the past to the future through a portal. The rules of this make no sense. But it's as this is happening that Cyborg realizes what's going on. He realizes that Crawl is the one who's been doing this, and that if he goes home right now, the village will be in danger. And as much as Cyborg needs to go home, let's be clear, he needs to go home. He's too high-tech for this environment. And as much as he reasonably probably shouldn't be here, because he is someone from the future meddling in the past, he can't just leave those people to potentially die, because throughout the entire episode, he's been developing a romance with Saracen. So he fights back against Krull. He doesn't have his weapons, but he's still powered, so he's still super strong. And this leads Krull to ask for more strength from the witch, causing her to merge him with a bunch of the creatures, transforming him seemingly forever, making him Cyborg's physical equal. And the subsequent fight drains Cyborg of the rest of his power. He is only saved by the villagers, who find him floating in the river and manage to rebuild his primitive generator into a larger scale hydroelectric generator, restoring some of his power before the generator explodes. He's only at 7% power, but at this point he's decided he's got to stay. He has to protect these people who he has come to care about, and so he dons armor, he takes his champion's sword, and he leads them in battle against Krull and the witch's forces. But there's a reason why he had to use his sonic cannon to kill these things earlier. There's a lot of them, and they're really, really resistant to physical attacks. So in the end, Saracen gets overwhelmed, and Cyborg intends to use, if not the rest of his power, then the majority of the rest of his power in one final strike to try to kill Krull off right then and there and save everyone. And it comes off as super desperate. It's actually pretty cool. The entire fight comes off as really super desperate. It's animated very claustrophobically. There's a lot going on all the time, and the mood is very dark and dour. You really do feel like this could be Cyborg's last battle. And then it ends on a heart-wrenching cliffhanger when, just as Cyborg fires off his shot, before he can see if it hits its target, before he can see if Saracen is saved, Raven manages to drag him back to the future, and for whatever reason she can't send him back, even though going back in time was presented as easier earlier in the episode. Again, the rules of this version of time travel make no sense. And obviously Cyborg is really down about all of this. He made the villagers a promise that he would stay and fight with them, and he's now unable to keep that promise. But Raven, being a good friend, brings him an old book that she just happens to have, which has the history of that village in it, and it turns out they did survive, and it even seems like he was supposed to be a part of their history for that short period of time. So between that and the fact that he puts his armor and weapon on display, implying that he's never going to forget these people as long as he lives, seems to help put him at ease and allow him to move on. There is a lot of good in this episode. I'm going to say that starting off, because I'm about to rip into it pretty hard here in a minute. The idea of transplanting Cyborg into a setting where he can't rely on modern technology to solve his problems is a really interesting idea at heart. But I don't feel that this episode executes it nearly as well as it could have. When it comes right down to it, the fact that Cyborg's eventual decision to stay hinges on the fact that he has come to care about these people, particularly Saracen, who he is in a romantic relationship with by the end. I really do think that this should have at least been a two-parter. I really feel like this particular narrative would have benefited from us having the time to get to know these characters, because Cyborg's only there for part of a 20-minute episode. There's a lot of jumping around, a lot of implied time skips, during which Cyborg certainly could have gotten to know these people, but if he did, we never see it. It really does feel like he barely meets them and then devotes the rest of his life to them because their leader happens to be really attractive. And don't get me wrong, Saracen's design is great. I can buy that Cyborg would be attracted to her. And the few scenes that they do share together, the subtleties in the voice acting and the animation, do go a long way towards selling their relationship to me. It's just, they barely know each other. Yes, time was implied to have passed during all of this, time that we didn't get to see, but we didn't get to see it. There's a reason why the adage show don't tell exists. Could you imagine if this had been a two-part or maybe even a three-part episode where we started out with Cyborg in the village wanting nothing but to leave, but feeling obligated to stay and help against these monsters, getting to know the blacksmith guy and getting to know Saracen really well, and even getting to know Crawl, only for us to learn over the course of the next episode or two that Crawl was actually the villain, whereas we had thought it was just the witch up to that point, giving Crawl something memorable about his character for us to latch onto, because as a villain, Crawl, as he exists in this show, is super boring and super forgettable. Like, I had honestly forgotten that he was a thing at all until I went back to rewatch this. But imagine if he had been Cyborg's friend up until the point that we found out that he was actually the baddie. That would have been super neat. Getting to know the other individual villagers would have lent weight to Cyborg's decisions to help them. And maybe spending a little bit of time in the village when there was actually time for downtime would have given us the chance to actually form some impression of the village in our minds, because I already don't remember anything about the village, and I just watched the episode like 20 minutes ago. Like, there's a river, and there's a dam, and there's buildings. That's it. That's the impression that this village left on me, because otherwise it was super bland and boring. But if we had actually gotten some downtime in the village that wasn't them rushing to establish the relationship between Cyborg and Saracen, maybe it would have reached a point where the viewer actually cared about it, where we might have actually become at least partway convinced that Cyborg was actually going to end up staying here, because after all, his arc is over. Like, I know he still does stuff in the future of the show, but his character arc and his main story are both over, and the show has been implying that they're going to send him off somewhere for a while now. What if immediately after not sending him off to join up with Titans East, they instead had him decide genuinely to stay in the past with these people? Like, even if this had been a 3-part episode, I wouldn't necessarily think that that was going to happen, but there would have at least been the impression that it was possible. In the case of this one-off episode, though, as rushed as it was clear that this was never going to be a new status quo, that this wasn't going to last. I guess what it comes down to is, while there are some really cool things in here, that final fight is really cool and dynamic, and Saracen as a character works better than she probably should, considering how little we got to see her. The episode ends up being kind of boring and forgettable after all is said and done, because it ends up trying to do way more than it could have ever pulled off. And considering that we haven't ever really gotten a consistent impression of how long Cyborg can go without recharging in the first place, and considering that how much power he tended to use from one situation to the next was inconsistent even within this episode, I'd even go so far as to say that this episode didn't even make good use of the initial premise of transplanting Cyborg into an environment where he couldn't recharge himself. Couple that with the fact that I don't think Cyborg ever mentions these events again. Like, I could be wrong, but if he does, I don't remember. It's not in a memorable way. And I think that this is actually a pretty disappointing episode. Like, I don't know that I'd say that it's bad, it's not good either. As per usual, though, guys, I'd like to know, what do you think of Cyborg the Barbarian if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.